Hello, and good evening, at least from where I am in New York currently. It's a tremendous privilege to be able to address you for this Zoom conference, really time of chizuk. For all of us, it should be a zechus for all of the chayalim, for all of the shvuyim, for all of Klal Yisrael, that we have this learning time together. The topic that I'm speaking about is certainly a current topic and a difficult topic to discuss in light of current circumstances, and that is about pidyon shvuyim, about redeeming captives during wartime in particular, and obviously that's very much on our minds right now. I had the suchus of attending the rally last week in Washington, D.C., the March for Israel, together with approximately 300,000 others. And one of the rallying calls was bring them home, bring them home, bring them home. And you almost felt every single time that those words were chanted that it was another step in the direction of really accomplishing something towards bringing them home. That everything that we do in terms of praying for the welfare of the shvuyim, in terms of petitioning the politicians who may be involved in negotiations, who certainly have a seat at the table, that it all makes a difference. Ultimately, we pray for siyata d'shmaya, but we understand that we're supposed to do our part, and it's a complicated inyan, a complicated matter that has been discussed a number of times in the past when there have been Israeli soldiers or Israeli citizens who were taken captive, and the question becomes, what is the price that one pays in order to ransom them, in order to bring them home? Is there a price that's too high? How does one conduct the negotiations, particularly during wartime, when the main goal and objective of war is, as it must be, to defeat the enemy? And if a condition for getting back the shvuyim is to allow the enemies to escape, so to speak, and to be able to continue to build their artillery and their weapons and their plans of destructions, God forbid, against the Jewish state and the Jewish people, that's also not exactly the result that is being sought. So what we really seek to accomplish is to defeat the enemy and also to have the return of the shvuyim, of the hostages. So the first thing to establish is that the mitzvah, pidyon shvuyim, of redeeming hostages, of redeeming captives, is considered to be a mitzvah rabbah. The Gemara talks about a particular royal figure, the mother of Shavur Malka, who sent an enormous sum of coins to Rav Yosef and said, I want all of this money, a giant treasury of money, to be used for a mitzvah rabbah. And then everyone sat around and tried to figure out what is a mitzvah rabbah. The Gemara, which is in Baba Basra, Daf, finally concludes that the greatest mitzvah rabbah is to redeem captives. Because captives are in the most compromised possible state that anyone can be in, because they're uncertain as to whether they're going to be killed, which is a possibility, whether they're going to be starved, which is a possibility, and whether they're going to be tortured in other ways, just the unknown fate that awaits them with every single possible calamity, which is awaiting them at the hands of their captors, God forbid, places them in the most precarious possible position. As the Gemara says, kulhu itanhu bey, every single terrible thing that could happen is a real and distinct possibility when it comes to shvuyim, when it comes to those who are captive. Says the Rambam in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim Paraches, Ein Lecha Mitzvah Rabbah K'Pinyan Shvuyim. There is no mitzvah which is greater than Pidyon Shavuyim. We know you're allowed to sell a Sefer Torah in order to redeem captives. The Mishnah Berurah paskins you can even sell a shul if necessary for the purpose of redeeming captives. There's nothing that we stop at, and yet at the same time, the Gemara in Gittin tells us that there are certain limitations that were imposed by the Chachamim as a matter of tikkun ha'olam, for the betterment of the world, the betterment and the advantage of society, so that we not be overly oppressed based on our munificence when it comes to the ransoming of hostages. Says the Mishnah in Maseches Gittin and Daf Mem Hey, Ein podin es hashvuyim yeser al kedei demehen. You can't pay more than whatever is the market price. It's difficult to understand what exactly does that mean, the market price, but the simplest understanding is that there used to be a slave market, and every single human being could be sold as a slave on the slave market. Person has a certain value in that sense. You don't pay more than what is the person's value. What's the reason for that? It's a tikkun ha'olam. So there are two different explanations for this tikkun ha'olam that are provided by the Gemara. One explanation is because of dochka de tzibura. We don't want to overly oppress the community by impoverishing them, by having to pay outlandish sums of money every single time that somebody is taken a captive. So we have pity on the community. The second explanation is mishum below the gabu v'lai sutfei, that we're worried that if we're going to be too generous in terms of how much money we pay to redeem a captive, so then we're going to encourage the terrorists to grab, ligarbu, this really means grab, they're going to grab additional captives in the future because they know that from the Jews in particular, they can get better than market price, they can get outlandish sums, and therefore they're more likely to repeat it again, which is the reason that we hold like. So the Gemara brings some sort of a proof for that. The main reason seems to be that we're worried that it's going to be too much of a burden, because a ramification for that reason would be that, let's say that the family of the captive says, don't worry, we'll come up with all of the money, even though it's an outlandish sum, so it won't be an undue burden upon the rest of the community. So according to the first reason, we're just worried about overburdening the community, that would be okay. According to the second reason, that we're worried that the enemy is going to take more people captive so that they can get lots of extra money from additional hostages, so then it would not be okay. So the Gemara brings a proof that there was a certain individual, Levi bar Darga, who redeemed and ransomed his daughter who had been taken captive for an outlandish amount of money, that we must see that it's okay. So the Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily a proof, because maybe what Levi bar Darga did was not with the permission of the Chachamim. Maybe the rabbis didn't really approve of what he did. So it's left as an unresolved question. However, even though it's unresolved at this particular juncture in the Gemara, there are other sugyos throughout Shas that speak about redeeming captives and talking about a husband redeeming his wife. And when she's taken captive, how much money is he allowed to pay, etc., etc. From the various sugyos in the Gemara, the Rambam seems to come to the conclusion that the main reason that we hold like is the second reason, meaning that we're not primarily concerned about the dochka, the tzibura, the overbearing price upon the community, in which case one very generous individual might just decide to come up with all of the money on their own, maybe a close relative. But no, says the Rambam, what we're really concerned about is the second reason, that if we pay too much of a price, so then there's more of a fear and a concern that the enemy is going to take additional captives. That's what the Rambam says. It's in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, Paraches Halacha Yud Beis. Ein podin es hashvuyim b'yeser al demei b'nei tikkun ha'olam. You don't overpay for the ransoming of a captive. So that the enemies will not run after additional hostages in the future to take them a captive. That's what the Rambam says. And that's what the Shulchan Aruch says as well. Shelo Yiyu, this is in Yoredeya, Siman Reish Nun Beis, Sif Daled. Shelo Yiyu ha'oivim mosim asmim aleim l'shvosam. We don't want the enemies to be too encouraged, so to speak, to be tempted to take more hostages captive, because they know that they're going to be able to demand an exorbitant price for the hostages. Now, what presents a challenge, if one simply understands the sugya in this fashion, is that there's another Gemara that seems to indicate exactly the opposite. There's a Gemara in Gittin and Daf Nun Ches that talks about how at the time of the Churban of Bayis, destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, of the second Beis HaMikdash, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananya went to a giant city in Rome, and he was told that there was a captive there. There was an infant who had been taken captive by the Romans, and he was sitting in jail. He was sitting in a dungeon, and he's a very, very beautiful boy, very beautiful boy. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya figured, okay, I'll check this out. So he went and he quoted a pasuk, a verse, a statement from Chazal to see what the response would be from this young child. Maybe it was a toddler, was able to speak, but very, very young child is referred to as a tinok, as an infant. And the child responded with all kinds of wise words from the rabbis as to why it is that we've been placed in this terrible state, because Allah Hashem zuchatanu lo v'la'avu v'drachav v'lo shama b'soiroso. He starts quoting passages that we didn't listen to Hashem properly. So said Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya, this child is going to be a great scholar someday, and he's going to be a rabbinic leader of our people. I'm not going to leave from this place until I ransom him, this child, for whatever money they're going to demand. I'll pay it all. Now, this would seem to fly in the face of this tikkun olam, that you can't pay more than whatever is the going rate for what a person might be sold in the slave market and so forth. But the Gemara doesn't criticize Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya. It says, gives him a yashikoyach. He ransomed this child for whatever the rate was that was requested. And then this child became one of the Gedolei Ador. He was one of the great poskim, one of the great rabbis amongst the Jewish people. What was his name? Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, the famous Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So he became the great rabbi who was ransomed by Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya for an exorbitant sum. So Tosfos, in a couple of places, Tosfos asked the question, why was this permitted? Why was this permitted? And Tosfos gives a number of different answers. One answer that Tosfos gives is that the general takana that was established, that you're not allowed to ransom somebody for more than what is the going rate, what's their worth. That's only for a regular person. But when you're dealing with a Talmid Chacham Mufrag, you're dealing with an individual who is going to be a great rabbinic leader, so then that's a totally different story, because such a person is too valuable in terms of their role in the Jewish story, in terms of our ongoing legacy and our ongoing heritage, that you have to redeem such a person no matter what it's worth. Now, you might say that this also is based on the principle that we're primarily worried when you pay too much, they're going to take somebody else. And how many Gedolei Ador are there? How many individuals are there who are going to be in this category? So therefore, you don't have to necessarily worry that it will happen again. We could just say the takana didn't apply to this particular situation. That's one exception. One exception to the rule, which is stated by Tosfos. Now, this exception, as Rav Asher Weiss points out, will not necessarily be applicable every single time that a soldier is taken hostage, that a citizen is taken hostage, because most people are not going to be in this category, shall we say, of a Gedolei Ador. It's interesting, because even when there was a situation of somebody who was in this category of Gadol Ador, who clearly qualified for this exception, one of the most famous stories of not ransoming somebody for more than whatever is the normal rate, relates to none other than the Maharami Rutenberg, who was the Rebbe of the Rosh of Rabbeinu Asher. The Maharami Rutenberg was the reigning great Talmid Chacham of his generation, 13th century or so. And there was a German king at the time who was making trouble for the Jews, and Maharami Rutenberg tried to escape from Germany, but they stopped him and they imprisoned him. And they said to the Jewish community, we're only going to let your great rabbi go if you pay an exorbitant sum of money for him. Really a very outrageous sum of money that was being demanded of the Jewish community. And there were, in fact, disciples of the Maharami Rutenberg who were prepared to pay the sum. Maharami Rutenberg said, nothing doing. He wouldn't allow himself to be ransomed. He said, you're not allowed to pay more than whatever is the standard market rate. And this is an outrageous sum. And better that I should stay in prison. And he did. And he did. And he stayed in prison for 7 years after that until he passed away in prison. It was another number of years afterwards that his body was basically wasting away in prison, that they finally did give an amount of money to ransom the body, and the Jew who paid the money to bring the body to burial was actually granted the privilege of being buried right next to the remains of the Maharami Rutenberg. That's the conclusion of the story. But during his lifetime, he refused to be redeemed. So the Maharshal, Shlomo Luria, already a 16th century great rabbinic scholar, the Maharshal says, I don't understand. The halacha, as stated by Tosfos, based on the story in Maseches Gittin, is that if we know the person is a great Torah scholar, even a child who's destined to be a great Torah scholar, you're allowed to redeem the person for more than they're worth. So why did the Maharami Rutenberg refuse it? So explains the Maharshal, the Maharami Rutenberg is very smart. He figured that what is really underlying the reason why you could pay the exorbitant sum of money, because we need great Torah teachers. But the Maharami Rutenberg saw that there was a great plot afoot, that the plan was that they were going to take hostage all of the great Torah leaders, and eventually the communities would run out of money. They wouldn't be able to redeem them all, and you would not have proper Torah instruction and learning amongst the Jewish people, because all of the great Torah leaders would be taken ransom. So therefore, he needed to nip this in the bud. In fact, even his own student, Rabbeinu Asher, they tried to take Rabbeinu Asher around the same time hostage as well, but he managed to escape. So we see, says the Maharshal, that this really was a more grand plot that was being planned by the enemies of the Jewish people, by the government at that point in time, by the evil government at that time. And therefore, it was, perhaps you can say, he doesn't use this terminology, I'll use this terminology, it was kind of like Eis Lasos Hashem Efeiru Torah Secho, that even though the Torah itself would require a ransoming of the hostage for more than whatever is the going rate in this situation, the Maharshal felt that the Maharami Rutenberg felt, that for the sake of preserving the future of Torah teaching amongst the Jewish people, it was necessary for him to make himself an exception and not allow himself to be ransomed for an exorbitant sum under those circumstances. But if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the strict black letter law, so to speak, is that somebody who is like a Maharami Rutenberg could be ransomed for more than his worth. Is there any other possible answer? Well, another answer that Tosfos gives is B'shas HaChurban Shani. This was different because it was the time of the Churban, the time of destruction for the Jewish people. How does that help the equation? The Meiri explains, Menachem Meiri, Rishon explains the reasoning for that answer of Tosfos. Says the Meiri, because there was nobody else to take captive. Everybody had been sent into exile. Everybody who could be taken captive had been taken captive. Everybody who could be killed had been killed. There wasn't any leverage left at the time of the Churban when it came to Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, because there was nothing else bad that the enemy, that the Romans could have done to the Jewish people. Whatever terrible things they had done, they had already done. So here too, that would not be applicable, thank God, in our current situation where there still is the possibility of taking people who otherwise are not imprisoned, people who are otherwise not exiled. And there is a possibility that if you embolden the enemies by paying them too much, so then they might, in fact, be incentivized to take other people hostage as well. Then there's a third reason that Tosfos gives, and this is a very controversial reason. Very controversial. It's interesting. Tosfos gives it many act as if it never happened. But Tosfos gives a third reason. Tosfos says that not in both places where Tosfos discusses this subject. Tosfos discusses it in two different places in the Gemara. But in one place, Tosfos says, you know why it was okay to pay more than the market price for Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha? It's because there was sakanas nefashos, because his life was at stake. His life was at stake. And ki'ika sakanas nefashos, this is on Tosfos Nun Ches Amud Aleph Maseches Gittin, hodin shvuin yosef kadei demand. Then you pay more than whatever is at the market price because the person's life is otherwise at stake. And he brings a proof from the case that another sugya in the Gemara about a person who's constantly selling themselves to pay off the debts, and we say, we're not going to constantly redeem this person, but if their life is in danger, then we do redeem the person. So some say that's not really such a good proof, because that just goes to show that we would redeem the person even if they keep on selling themselves to the enemy to a second time, a third time, a fourth time, but not that we would pay more than market price. But Tosfos says no. It also shows us that we would pay more than market price. So we see that when there is sakanas nefashos, when there is a danger to a person's life, so then we pay more than the going rate in order to save that person. Now, some say that really there are multiple answers that Tosfos gives. In that very same Tosfos gave that answer and also said, because this child was going to be a great Talmid Chacham. So the Maharam Lublin says that, the first answer was based on the concern that maybe it'll be too oppressive for the community. So we say, well, the community has to pay lots of money anyway if somebody's life is in danger. So for sakanas nefashos, we make an exception. The second answer, though, is assuming that we don't follow the concern that of dochka de tzibur, that we're concerned about overburning the community. No, we're concerned they're going to do it again. So even if you're saving somebody because their life is in danger, if you're paying too much money, then the enemy is going to do it again. More lives are going to be in danger, and therefore that's not going to be permitted. We'll allow an exception for a Talmid Chacham, which is an unusual circumstance, but we're not going to say that every single time a person's life is in danger is going to be permitted to pay an exorbitant sum. In fact, the Ramban says the same thing. The Ramban says every captive who's taken into captivity, their life is in danger. That's what the Gemara in Baba Basra was saying as to why it's such a big mitzvah to ransom captives, because their life is in danger, their health is in danger, everything about them is in danger. And yet, nonetheless, despite the fact that we're talking about captives, there was a takana that you can't ransom them for an exorbitant sum. But others say, no, your normal captive is taken into captivity. Yes, of course, there's a possibility that they'll be killed, but it's not necessarily clear and present danger. It's not, the captors are primarily interested in getting money. However, when you have captors, when you have vicious terrorists who make it clear that they're capable of murdering in cold blood, I think like we've seen, unfortunately and tragically in our current situation, and you know that they mean business, that there is a distinct possibility this is something that, God forbid, they could do. So then that's a totally, totally different story. That's what the Stei Chemet says. It's what the Meiri intimates. There are different levels of sakanas nefashos, of a person's life being in danger. So over the years, because the Shulchan Aruch perhaps does not bring this particular exception of sakanas nefashos, so many didn't hold by it. The Maharam Lublin famously did not think that this was a basis for ransoming somebody for an exorbitant sum. But he said you still have to worry they're going to take other people into captivity, even if their life is very clearly in danger, following on the heels of the Ramban. On the other hand, the Maharshal held differently. He held that we do, in fact, hold like this reason, that we're concerned about sakanas nefashos, and amongst the contemporary rabbinic decisors, this has always been a sore spot. Whenever there was a case where the government of Israel was negotiating a deal where they would give up many of the prisoners that had been taken from the terrorists in return for the terrorists and the enemy giving up one Jewish hostage or two Jewish hostages, and it seemed like it's not really an even-sided deal. You're going to get one hostage back, and you have to give up 1,000 terrorists or something like that. And you had many rabbinic authorities screaming, "This is Yosem Mikdei demand." So some made this argument, but it's Sakanas Nefashos. Rabbi Yosef, a great lover of the Jewish people, of every individual Jew. That's why everybody loved Rabbi Yosef, because he had tremendous apathy. So I said, well, a Jewish life is in danger. So you worry you're going to release terrorists, and that's going to cause more harm. He says, who knows? Maybe you'll be able to stop them. You don't know for sure that they're going to cause more harm, but I do know for sure that this person is about to get killed if I don't ransom them. There's a good chance they might get killed if I don't ransom them. So therefore, you pay a heavy price. You could be prepared to pay a heavy price. That was certainly his approach, but many did not follow that approach, including Roshel Israeli. That they said you have to be concerned. Mordechai Eliyahu as well said no. A little bit of a suffix, of a doubt that maybe these terrorists that you're releasing are going to go on a rampage against the Jewish people, and they're going to terrorize more people. It's a vados. You know that this is what they're signed up to do. So therefore, this definitely falls into the category that we don't want to encourage them to take more hostages. And not only that, but in addition to the fact that they're going to cause more mayhem, God forbid, if you're going to release them, it also takes away the deterrent effect of the terrorists who feel that if they're caught in their tracks and they'll be put into prison, so maybe it'll be a deterrent if they know they're going to be put into prison. But if they know that they're not going to have to sit that long in prison, because all that has to happen is that their compatriots will take another Jewish soldier hostage, and then they'll be able to get out of prison as part of the prisoner swap deal that enables that hostage to be released. So then they won't worry as much about being taken prisoner. So there were a number of rabbinic authorities who felt that you really can't compromise based on that principle, but others felt, no, Sakanas Nefashos is a very, very real concern. There's another exception that Tosfos talks about, because Tosfos asked the question that, according to the opinion of the Chachamim, there's a machlokes elsewhere in the Gemara between the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel about if a man's wife is taken captive. So, and the captors ask us for a ransom price, which is 10 times her value. So can the husband pay it, or does he not pay that amount of money? So the Chachamim say, yeah, you're supposed to pay that amount of money, at least the first time. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, in Podin demand, you don't pay more than what is the market price. So therefore, you're not allowed to pay that amount of money. The Rambam, in fact, holds like the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and that would maybe explain why here it's not a burden on the entire community, only on the husband, but the Rambam holds like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that you still shouldn't do it. So that might be the basis, at least the Ran suggests, that might be the basis of why the Rambam seemed to hold that the main concern that we have is that more people are going to be taken captive in this fashion. But according to the Chachamim, you do pay the exorbitant sum. So, and the Ramah holds that way. So according to Tosfos, that we have to understand what the exception is. In this case, according to the Chachamim, Tosfos asked the question, so in this particular case, why do the Chachamim allow for a ransoming of 10 times the price of the wife by the husband? What's the reason? So Tosfos gives a very interesting explanation. Tosfos says, you know what the reason is? The reason is because ishto kegufo, because a man's wife is considered to be like the man himself, more so than even a man's daughter. A man's wife is an extension of davak v'ishto v'ayuda v'asar echad, considered to be an extension of his own identity. And Tosfos makes the following comment, and this is Paskin in Shulchan Aruch. This is Paskin in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says this principle, that on the prisoner himself or herself, there was never a takana made by the Chachamim that you couldn't pay more than whatever is the market price. Meaning, if a person is not redeeming a third party, but a person is redeeming himself or herself, and they have the money for it, and they say to the captors, I'll give you $1 million, no problem. That person is allowed to do that. There was never a tikkun olam stopping the individual person from doing this. So from that discussion regarding this particular case, comes a separate type of consideration with respect to the wartime cases that are discussed in contemporary times. And that is as follows, that when you have a soldier, for example, and we can expand this, you have a soldier who goes out to war, so it's very important for a soldier to have good morale. Part of what builds good morale is the soldier knows that in the event that he or she is going to be taken captive, that the government is going to do everything in their power in order to save them, in order to rescue them, in order to ransom them from their captors. Some of the commentaries even say that there's a sense of responsibility, that if you send somebody into a dangerous situation, something bad happens to them, so you bear a certain level of responsibility. It's like a shlichut. So the government bears a certain level of responsibility in this activity as a shlichut. And there is sort of this notion, and this is something that the same Rabbi Israeli I mentioned earlier also is quoted as endorsing, that because shlucho shel adam kemoso, persons serving on behalf of the government, and therefore they are sort of an extension of the government. So if the government pays, call it an exorbitant sum, an outlandish sum, they're not just paying for themselves on behalf of somebody else. They're paying for themselves because every single soldier is an extension of the government. So therefore, they are actually paying a ransom price for themselves, which is permitted according to the halacha. So this is one important consideration. Rav Ovadia Yosef mentions another consideration, which is also picked up upon by some of the other poskim, which is that other reason that Tosfos mentioned in passing about, Shasa Chorban Shaini, the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, so that was very different. So I gave you an explanation from Mimi that, there was nobody really left to take captive because everybody had been sent into captivity already. Well, that's one explanation. But another explanation of Shasa Chorban Shaini goes like this. Shasa Chorban Shaini means that at a time of destruction, what is it the enemies want to do? They want, Rahmanu Litzlan, they want to destroy us. They want to kill us. They want to take us hostage, not just to get ransom money, but because they really want to hurt us in every single way possible. And one way that they could hurt us is by taking us captive and leading us into that compromised situation of captivity. And they're doing it in part out of pure and unbridled sadism. So says Rav Ovadia Yosef that the concern regarding that if you pay an exorbitant sum, then they might come and they'll take hostage more people to get more exorbitant sums in the future. He said that would be the only reason that they would take us hostage. But if they're intent on taking us hostage anyway, because they just want to really hurt us, they want to kill us and they want to destroy us and they want to break our morale, and that's another reason why they would take people hostage. So that is kind of like this is what Rav Ovadia intimates, and others say it more explicitly. That's kind of like Shasa Chorban. That's a Shasa Chorban consideration. Just like there's no problem of paying an exorbitant sum to Shasa Chorban because they would take us captive anyway. So he says the same thing may be true in a situation where you have a very hostile enemy. So this is all in terms of the exceptions that are discussed in the Gemara and how they may or may not apply to some of the hostage deals that are discussed nowadays. But there's two more considerations I'd like to mention. So one of the considerations runs as follows, which is, what was the actual takana? The actual takana was, Ein podin es hashvuyim yesem michdei demand. You don't pay more than whatever is in the market price. So what is the market price? So the Rami Lublin says, and you can find some support for this based on a Rashi and Ksuvas Stapnan base. The market price is how much is the person royally market b'shuk? If we would have a slave market, how much would the person be sold on a slave market? So I ask you, where can you find a slave market nowadays? Well, maybe you can find one that's totally illegal, but in terms of a legal, legitimate slave market, there is no legitimate slave market nowadays. We don't have slavery. We've moved beyond the point of slavery at this point in time. So there is no slave market today. So then how do you define Yosem Michtei demand? So the Radbaz, quoted by the Piskei Tshuva in Yoredei Siman Meishin and Beis, the Radbaz says, you know what? Nowadays, Rabbi is speaking the 16th century, but Rabbi says nowadays, when we speak about Michtei demand, Yosem Michtei demand, it means more than whatever is the normal amount that you pay terrorists for redeeming hostages. Let's say it wouldn't be a Jewish hostage, it would be a non-Jewish hostage, it would be pirates, terrorists that took people hostage. How much do they generally demand? So whatever that sum is, it might be much more than what a person would be sold for had there been a slave market. But if you're paying whatever is the going rate that is generally charged by terrorists, so if you pay the going rate, that's not considered to be Yosem Michtei. The going rate could be $100,000, could be $500,000, whatever it is. If that's the going rate, so that's not considered to be Yosem Michtei demand. Rav Reiss, in his discussion of the subject, goes further and he says, I don't think there is such a thing as a Yosem Michtei demand if we're not talking about money. Yosem Michtei demand, the word demand means their money. If the deals are not deals of money, in fact, there was already some poskim like the Knesset Yechezkel who said that in those places where they don't really care about money, they care about other things. So then there is no prohibition of paying an exorbitant sum altogether. And here too he says, let's say we're not talking about money, they're not even asking for money. They're asking for a return of some of the prisoners that we have, of the terrorists, something, a prisoner exchange, something like that. That was never included in the Takana. So if it was never included in the Takana, so then you go back to the original din, which is why it's so important to start with the original din. What's the original din here? What's the original founding paramount principle that we're starting out with? That's the principle that Ein L'cha Mitzvah Rabba K'Pinyan Shvuyim. Like the Rambam said, there's no bigger mitzvah than Pinyan Shvuyim. You have a mitzvah Pinyan Shvuyim, you have a question mark whether a particular situation lends itself to the takana that you can't redeem a particular person because of other concerns. So if this case doesn't fall squarely within the takana, namely because the takana related to paying an exorbitant sum of money, and here we're not talking about money, we're talking about other things, so then we go back to the original din. The original din is that you redeem captives. You might have a separate concern, namely, okay, so maybe the takana that you can't ransom somebody for more than he's worth or she's worth is no longer applicable. But there's another takana, there's another law, which is that you're not allowed to put people in a sakana. You're not allowed to forfeit, to give up the lives of one group of people in order to save another person. That's a whole discussion in the Tosefta, Yerushalmi of Trumos. So many of the poskim discuss that, and some are very concerned about that. Rabbi Yosef, as I said, he gives a deflection to that. He said that the Ein Safek Motzi Midei Vadai. There's a Vadai, there's a definite situation where if I don't redeem this captive, then their life is in very, very serious jeopardy. And with respect to everybody else, I don't know when I release the other prisoners whether they're going to cause murder or not cause murder. And we saw that there are different opinions as to what degree we really accept the argument that it's only a suffix, that it's only a doubtful situation as opposed to a certain situation. But there's another reason why Yosem Michtei demand may not be applicable over here. And this is a major, major discussion amongst the poskim. And it runs as follows. Says, we're not talking about individuals who are taken captive in a peace situation. We're talking about war. When you're talking about war, there's a very different objective at play. When you're talking about war, you have a certain mitzvah. And that mitzvah is that you have to defeat the enemy. That's the idea of a mechemes mitzvah. Mechemes mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to go to war. It's not a mitzvah to go to war to lose. No. It's a mitzvah to go to war to win, to defeat the enemy. Anything which could be a distraction or anything which could diminish your chances of defeating the enemy is something which you have to be very circumspect about doing during a time of war, even if it means that there are hostages who will not be redeemed right away, because redeeming them or giving in to certain of the demands of the terrorists of the enemy is going to be detrimental to your mission and objective of winning the war. So then that's a totally different consideration. This is why in the early 1970s, when there was a plane, I believe it was an Air France plane, that was hijacked, and the hijackers were demanding all kinds of different demands and so forth. And one of the prisoners who was taken by this Air France hijacking was none other than Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner. Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner is Zatzal, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin. And for some interesting reason, I guess that the terrorists realized that he was sort of in a different stature than maybe the other hostages. So they put him in a separate standalone location for a period of time before he was reunited with the other hostages. That there was an offer that was made by students of Hutner, not surprisingly, that they would pay some exorbitant sum of money in order to redeem Rav Hutner. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal, who was then the Rosh Yeshiva of, Torah V'das. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said, nothing doing. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said that even though there is this exception that we discussed earlier, that you can redeem a great Talmid Chacham, Gadol Ador, Rav Hutner certainly fell into all of those categories for more than whatever is the going rate. That does not apply b'shas milchama. Doesn't apply during a time of war. Herschel Schachter Shlita discusses this case in his Sefer B'ikvei Hatzon, that ever since 1948, we've had ups and downs, we've had ebbs and flows, but fundamentally, said Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, he was speaking prior to the Yom Kippur War and prior to everything, all the hostilities that have occurred since that time over the past 50 years. He said, we have been in a perpetual state of war. We are in a state of milchama. You're in a state of milchama, you don't operate according to the normal rules of pidyon shivuyim, of redeeming captives. Your sole goal has to be to defeat the terrorists. So you don't give in by empowering them and making them more dangerous. So therefore, he felt that the fact that it was wartime took away from all of these general rules regarding the laws of ransoming captives, even to the extent of saying, you don't ransom the captives so quickly if it's going to compromise your ability to emerge victorious over the enemy. So, by the same token, there are certain writers who have written that so too, on the other side of the equation as well, we also, when we are in a situation of war, and we have to think about what's going to be best for the country, what's going to be best for the morale of the troops, what's going to be best for the morale of all of the citizens of the country. And citizens also kind of like to feel that they're being protected by their government in the state of Israel, that if anything happens to them or their family, the government will do everything in their power in order to save them. So the same exact consideration that could militate in favor of saying, leave the captives alone for now, because right now we have to focus completely and without any distraction upon defeating the enemy. Well, that the same thought process could also cause us to say, we're in a wartime now, and therefore all of the principles of Ein Podin and Sashvuyim Yosem Michdei Demand are not applicable, because the focus is the war, and maybe in order to win the war, based on building up our morale, based on what's good for the country, based on what's good for the future of the country, we have to do everything in our power to redeem the captives, even at what might be viewed as an exorbitant price. Some make the argument as well, exorbitant price, once we speak about going rates and things of that sort. So at what point do you say that it's exorbitant? How many terrorists are considered to be worth more than one Jewish person? You could say that one Jewish person from our side is worth more to us than all of the terrorists combined. That's a separate discussion, which is why really during wartime, the main focus is to what degree do you have to worry that the release of the terrorists in exchange for the hostages to come home, if that would be part of the deal, to what degree is that really going to be detrimental to your goal of winning the war? But to the degree that you can make a deal, even if it involves some sort of a prisoner exchange, where you think overall, because of morale considerations and other types of military strategic considerations, is going to be beneficial towards the overall campaign of enabling you to emerge victorious, of enabling your country to feel good about itself, of the Chayolim to feel good about themselves, the citizens to feel good, and to be really in the stronger position as a result in terms of overcoming the enemy and everything that the enemy stands for. So then it can, in fact, factor into the equation, despite all the limitations that might exist during peacetime. There might be more flexibility for that reason during wartime. At the end of the day, it's a very difficult parsha because we pray and we plead to HaKadosh Baruch Hu every single day for the safe return of the hostages. We recognize that these types of cheshbonos, these types of wartime considerations, the Netziv of Cook and others, based on a Minchas Chinuch, many authorities, Rav Duchovsky recently wrote this in a volume that he published regarding these matters, that these are considerations that are very much wartime based when it comes to our unique situation. So learning the sugya of Ein Podin es Hashum Yosem Mikdei Demein certainly informs us halachically, gives us a little bit of guidance as to the principles that we hold near and dear, and that generally are our guidepost in terms of dealing with these challenging situations. But ultimately, in terms of the current situation, much really depends upon the military strategic calculus, those who are involved in negotiations, those who are involved in military strategy, and they have to really take into account what's going to be the most beneficial towards the war effort right now. And we pray that they should be given siyata d'shmaya to make good judgments and to make correct judgments, and that whatever the judgments are, they should lead to peace, they should lead to an end to this war, and they should lead to the safe release of the hostages. So this year, I pray as well, should be a zuchus for the safe release of the hostages, of the remaining hostages, as soon as possible. They should be safely returned to their homes and to their families, to Klal Yisrael, and we should be the recipients of the blessing that Malcolm Yerachem Aleim Yotziem Yisara Levacha Me'afela Leora Mishubi Shibu the Gula Hashta Bagalo Risman Kariv V'Nomar Amen.